If under the circumstances you want to take us to court, please do.
I'll see you in court, Mr. McCulloch.
John James, as he said he would, brought suit against James McCulloch and the Bank of the United States. What James demanded was that the federal bank pay the state tax as well as a fine of $2,500 for having issued unauthorized notes. The case was heard on May 8, 1818, in the County Court of Baltimore County.
Mr. Martin?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Martin, Mr. Pinckney's just informed me that his client is willing to admit to the facts in this case.
That's reasonable. The bank's been doing business without paying the Maryland tax. It's common knowledge.
I take it your client is aware of the provisions of the law.
He is, Your Honor.
Well, then, is there any reason why this court should not find him guilty as charged?
Yes, Your Honor, there is. We suggest that the Maryland law is unconstitutional.
Unconstitutional?
No state under the Constitution may lay a tax on a federal agency.
Your Honor.
Mr. Martin.
Maryland's a sovereign state, Your Honor. The right to raise revenues by laying taxes is founded in her sovereignty and guaranteed by the Constitution. Mr. Pinckney, I'm sure, will recall that under the Constitution, only exports, imports, and tonnage are exempt from state taxation. Does he know of any reason why this exemption should be seen as including a bank?
The right to tax without limit or control is essentially a power to destroy. The power to destroy a federal agency clearly isn't granted by the Constitution to any state.
The argument works both ways, Your Honor. If the right to tax, in fact, implies the power to destroy, why do we allow the federal government to tax state banks? And we do allow it, don't we? Surely, if the federal government may tax state banks, the states may tax the federal bank.
The Baltimore County Court sustained John James. McCulloch appealed, and the case went to the Maryland Court of Appeals. Here the crucial question arose. Had Congress the power to create a bank in the first place?
Mr. Martin.
Your Honors, Mr. Pinckney claims that the right to tax implies the right to destroy. If this be the case, Your Honors, we should resist federal taxation of our state banks with as much determination as the federal government now resists taxation of its banks by the states. As a matter of fact, we've accepted federal taxation of our banks. Now, either both parties have the right to lay this tax or none.
Not so, Your Honors. Federal government and state governments under the Constitution are not equals. The federal government is supreme. Federal law, Your Honors, supersedes state law. Article 6 of the Constitution. Mr. Martin, I'm sure, will recall it.
He does indeed. Federal law is the supreme law of the land, yes, provided, Your Honors, provided it has been enacted in pursuance of the powers vested in Congress by the Constitution. Now, as it so happens, the Constitution of the United States is silent, perfectly silent on the matter of chartering banks.
Mr. Martin, am I to understand that you consider the federal bank unconstitutional?
Your Honors, Congress twice chartered a federal bank. Each time, the question of its constitutionality was gone over in great detail.
Granted. However, the question as to whether or not the bank's constitutional is not for Congress to decide. It's reserved for the Supreme Court of the United States.
Throughout 1818, states' rights men across the country rallied to attack the federal bank. Prominent among them were Virginians, men like Spencer Roane, judge on Virginia's Court of Appeals, Thomas Ritchie, publisher of the influential Richmond Enquirer, John Taylor, planter and political philosopher, John Brockenbrough, president of the Bank of Virginia, whose mansion in time would become the White House of the Confederacy. Taylor and Roane were disciples of Thomas Jefferson. Like Jefferson, they were profoundly suspicious of federal power. When they spoke of their country, they spoke of Virginia, not the United States.
The banks are necessary and proper means to carry into execution the great objectives of our federal government. Well, if a bank's a necessary and proper means of government, what is not? You know, it's not too long ago that we defeated in Congress a bill which would have given the federal government the right to operate the copper mines at Roosevelt, New Jersey. How did they try to justify that? By the doctrine of implied powers. Just as they're trying to justify the bank. Congress, they said, is authorized by the Constitution to provide for our common defense. Well, ships are necessary for our defense. Copper is necessary to build ships. A mine is necessary to provide the copper. A company is necessary to operate the mine. Therefore, Congress is authorized by the Constitution to operate the Roosevelt copper mines. Yes, sir. If we allow this type of reasoning to remain unchecked, it won't be long before we'll have more to contend with than a federal bank. There'll be federally operated newspapers, federally operated mines, federally operated manufactories, federally operated stage lines, name it. And the federal government will have its hand in it. State rights will be at an end. And state rights in this country are the bulwark of our individual freedoms. Gentlemen, the federal bank must be destroyed. Now let the doctrine of implied powers remain unchecked, and we'll never again be able to place limits on our federal government.
In September of 1818, McCulloch versus Maryland was docketed in the Supreme Court of the United States. It then consisted of 7 men, Chief Justice Marshall and Associate Justices Washington, Johnson, Todd, Livingston, Story, and Duval.
Power, Mr. Marshall, to a public official, whether he holds his office by the will of the people or the grace of God. Power is what money's to a banker, not a means but an end, something of which he can never possess enough. That's the difficulty we're facing. The fact that our government is an elected one, in and of itself, is no guarantee at all against an abuse of power.
In your opinion, Mr. DeVille, what is
The Constitution, strictly interpreted. A grant to the federal government of powers not expressly vested in it by the Constitution, in my opinion, is dangerous in the extreme.
The Constitution, Mr. Duval, allows the federal government to enact all such laws as are necessary to carry into execution all powers that are expressly granted. What does that mean? Strictly interpreted?
The term necessary...
Strictly interpreted, it's virtually meaningless.
The term necessary, in my opinion, means indispensable. Not just convenient, not just useful, but indispensable. Congress, under the Constitution, may enact laws without which the expressly granted powers could not be carried into execution. A federal bank is useful. It is convenient. But is it indispensable? It's not.
Mr. DeVal, the need for a federal bank was proven twice. Not once, but twice. During our war for independence, and again during the war which we've now just barely brought to a successful end. Twice we almost perished for lack of a government having sufficient authority to ensure our survival.
The salient fact, Mr. Marshall, is that twice we survived without a federal bank.
Mr. DeVal, the word and the purse, all external relations, and a not inconsiderable portion of the industry of the nation are entrusted to Congress. Now, it seems to me that a government entrusted with such vast powers can also be entrusted with ample means to discharge its tasks. Why cling to an interpretation of the Constitution which makes government operations difficult, even hazardous, and expensive? Expensive not only in terms of money, but also of lives.
The Chief Justice has it. When the American people decided to form a union and to establish a federal government, they meant for it to ensure their welfare. You don't think, do you, that the framers of the Constitution, after granting vast powers for the public good, intended to impede their exercise by withholding a choice of means?
You say ample means, Mr. Marshall. How ample? That is the question.
Let's answer it by saying that as long as the end is legitimate and within the scope of the Constitution, then the means, if they too conform to the spirit and letter of the Constitution, are legitimate as well.
That's rather too generous to suit me, frankly.
To be anything but generous, Mr. DeVal, is to rob the federal government of its ability to deal effectively with the nation's needs as they arise today and 100 years from now, when the world may not look quite as we see it.
Feeling against the federal bank ran high. Maryland, by now, was not the only state with a stake in the case. Half of the states in the Union had, like Maryland, laid a heavy tax on the federal bank. Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina, Kentucky, Ohio. Illinois and Indiana had gone even further, prohibiting the establishment of branches of the federal bank altogether. From Marshall's fellow Virginians, Roane, Ritchie, Brokenbrough, and the men who represented Virginia in Congress, Tyler, Burwell, Johnson, came a move to destroy the bank before the Supreme Court had an opportunity to hear the case. Virginia would ask Congress that the bank's federal charter be repealed.
Yes, Congressman. A motion to repeal. I don't know if it will carry. Congressman, the country is in one of the worst economic depressions since our war for independence. And whom are they blaming for it? Right or wrong, the federal bank. Feeding against the bank has never run higher. Will the motion carry? The people demand that the Congress set aside the Alien and Sedition